Good evening and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name's Katie Slocum and I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of York. I'll be chairing the event this evening, so thank you very much for joining us, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. So before I introduce your speaker, I just need to tell you a few technical things. So firstly, subtitles are available in this event. To turn these on or off, just use the CC Show Captions button at the bottom of the screen. And if you're watching this event live, you can post questions using the Q&A button on your screen. That's available throughout the whole talk, so please do post those questions at any time. I'm really excited to be able to ask those questions of the speaker on your behalf. And please again remember that today's event is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it again. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Jaap de Roode. Jaap is joining us this evening actually from a hotel room in Amsterdam, where he's just given another talk. But he works in the US, where he's a Samuel Candid Dobbs Professor of Biology at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. And Jaap is the director of the Infectious Diseases Across Scales training program at the university, where they train graduate students in interdisciplinary science to study and control infectious disease. So this evening, Jaap is going to talk to us about how animals can heal themselves. So it's a great pleasure for me to say, Jaap, over to you. Can't wait for your talk.
Thank you so much for having me, and so much. It's so fun to be at this great festival of fun ideas and great ideas. And it's really my pleasure to be here to talk to you tonight about how animals use medicine and what we can learn from them. And so what I would like to do is to really think about, how animals use medicine. How did I get to study that? And how did I actually start writing a book about that? And that whole story really starts with monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies are the system that I use for my studies at Emory University in Atlanta. And monarch butterflies are very famous for their annual migration, where there's literally tens to hundreds of millions of monarchs that undertake their migration from Canada and the United States down to central Mexico, where they come together in huge numbers. And this is really what makes monarch butterflies famous. And so when you go there, and this is a shot I took in 2006, very exciting to be there for the first time at that time. There are so many butterflies that sometimes you can't even see the trees for the butterflies. They're really there, piled up, layers upon layers on the trees. And it's really fascinating. And it's fascinating to a lot of people. And that's why monarch butterflies are very popular. They're so popular that a lot of people dress up like them. They're just so fascinated by them, and they celebrate them in festivals and everything like that. And I always say, I always find it amazing that we can have an insect that gets celebrated this much. There are very few people that would dress up like this if it had to do with a cockroach or something else. So monarch butterflies are just really beautiful creatures, very popular, and really speak to the imagination of a lot of people. It makes it a really grateful subject to study and to talk about science as well. Now, having said all that, that whole beautiful migration is not actually why I started studying monarch butterflies. I studied monarch butterflies because they become sick. And that is something that often surprises people, because we think of infectious diseases afflicting us and maybe our pets. We may take our pets to the vet because they are sick, but we often don't really think about wild animals being sick as well. But they do become sick, and that includes monarch butterflies. And monarch butterflies are infected very often with a parasite that is called Ophiocystis electroscira. It's actually a parasite most people would call OE for obvious reasons. It's a terrible name. So OE is very simple to use. But it's a very common parasite that occurs in monarch butterflies, and it forms a lot of spores that are shown in this picture here, spores on the abdomen of the butterfly. So an individual monarch butterfly can actually have millions of these spores just sitting there, and they can do a lot of damage to the monarch butterfly when they are there. And so this is a picture of a monarch that is very sick. So this is not your typical monarch butterfly picture that you may see in National Geographic or some kind of advertisement campaign. This is a monarch butterfly that is very sick. And so this monarch has so many of those spores on its abdomen that those parasites have really disrupted the skin on that abdomen, and the butterfly is kind of oozing liquids, and that makes it stuck, in this case, to the pupal case. So this monarch butterfly is never going to fly, never going to mate, never going to lay eggs. So it's really kind of dead already. In this case, we see a paper wasp on this picture, and that paper wasp is taking advantage of the whole situation. This is an easy prey for that wasp, so taking advantage of that. But this parasite, therefore, is very detrimental. This is what it can do. Now, one of the nice things about this parasite is that it's very easy to study. So we can put a little sticker on the abdomen of the butterfly and pull that off. And in doing so, we remove some of the scales of the butterflies, and we also pull off a lot of the little parasites. So the little specks in this picture are parasites. And monarchs can literally have hundreds of thousands or millions of these parasites. And the way that the parasite works is that when these adult butterflies, when they have those spores in their abdomen, when they lay eggs, they will actually drop some of those parasites onto the eggs and onto the milkweeds on which the eggs are laid. And then the caterpillars eat them up. And that's how they become infected. The parasites then go into the gut and they start growing inside the tissues. At the point that they become an adult butterfly, emerging from the chrysalis, the pupal case again, they're again covered in all of these parasite spores. So it's a parasite that's really detrimental to monarch butterflies. In addition to what I showed before, it also really reduces the ability of the monarchs to fly. And as you can imagine, that is really important for an insect that travels thousands of kilometers to reach its destination from Canada and the United States down all the way to Mexico. And the other thing that is really interesting about monarch butterflies is that they use very specific plants as caterpillars. So like many other butterflies, caterpillars are very specific to what they can and cannot eat. And for monarch butterflies, the only thing that caterpillars can eat are milkweeds. You know, if you gave them something else like lettuce or broccoli or anything like that, they just would die. There's no way they can eat that. So they're very specialized on milkweeds. But there are many different species of milkweed, and some of them are very toxic, and some of them are not very toxic at all. And when I first started studying monarch butterflies back in 2005, it was very well known that monarch butterflies take the toxins from the milkweeds and they put them into their own tissues, and that makes them toxic to their own predators, such as birds. However, I've always been interested in parasites. I actually did my PhD on malaria parasites. I came to monarch butterflies to study the parasites. So I was really curious to know if those same toxins can also be used as medicine, and if they have an effect against the parasites in the monarch butterflies as well. So we started with some very simple experiments where we reared caterpillars that were either infected with parasites or not, and then we reared them on toxic and non-toxic milkweed. And what we found is that when they're reared on this more toxic milkweed, that those plants act as medicine. So they reduce the probability that the monarch becomes infected, they reduce the growth of the parasite, and they improve the health of the monarch. So they really reduce the disease symptoms that the monarch butterflies suffer. And I thought that was such an intriguing finding, that you have this very strong medicine that monarchs can find in the wild, that the next question for me was whether monarch butterflies can use it actively as a form of medicine. And so really asking the question, when butterflies or their caterpillars are sick, can they choose specifically the medicinal milkweed that will make them better? And so we started with different experiments. We first were interested in finding out if caterpillars can eat more medicinal milkweed when they are sick, so when they have the parasites. And we did many different experiments. If you look carefully here, there's a tiny little caterpillar at the bottom of this leaf. That's a baby caterpillar fresh out of the egg. In about 12 days, they turn into this huge caterpillar. And so these caterpillars are very hungry, and they basically eat whatever comes their way first. So we found that infected caterpillars do not prefer to eat the medicinal milkweed. But in some ways, that's not that unexpected, because when you think about who makes the choices about what the caterpillars eat, it is not actually the caterpillars themselves. It's the mothers that lay eggs on the plants, and therefore they decide what their caterpillars are going to eat. So in the second set of experiments, what we did is to look at adult butterflies. So we had pregnant females. They were either infected or uninfected with the parasite. And then we put them in these big flight cages where we gave them a medicinal milkweed and a non-medicinal milkweed to then see if they would prefer to lay their eggs on the medicinal milkweed. And when we did this, we found a very strong preference indeed. So we found that the infected butterflies, when they are given this choice, they prefer to lay their eggs on the medicinal milkweed. And so that's really intriguing, right? Because what it tells us is that the caterpillars cannot medicate themselves when they are sick with this parasite. We also know that these adult butterflies that already have all these parasite spores on their abdomen, they cannot get rid of it. And they will ultimately drop some of those parasites on the eggs and the milkweeds when they are laying eggs. But what the female butterflies can do is that when they lay those eggs and transmit those parasites, they can also provide the medicine that will help their caterpillars so that when the caterpillars eat the parasites, they also eat the medicine at the same time that makes them less sick. So it's a really great example of mommy knows best. It's the mother butterflies that are really good at caring for their offspring, even before those offspring are alive, by providing the medicine that they will need. So what's really interesting about this to me is that it really shows that animals can use medicine. And for a long time in science, in Western science, people just wouldn't believe this. And I love this quote from William Osler, who gave an address at McGill University in 1894. William Osler was one of the founders of Johns Hopkins University. He was also the person who came up with educating doctors, not just in the classroom, but by the bedside, which is really important. But he said in his address that the desire to take medicine is one feature which distinguishes man, the animal, from his fellow creatures. And it was really so making this distinction between humans and other animals that we have something that other animals don't have, and that is the ability to use medicine. Now, I don't want to single him out because this is basically what everyone thought in Western society. And when we look at how people think about what separates humans from animals, first of all, there is a lot of desire to make us different from nature and different from other animals. And so people have said for a long time that the use of tools is something uniquely human, or the use of language, or the ability to have culture, or the possession of empathy. But all of these things you can find in other animals as well. And so the more we look, the more we can really debunk the whole idea that things that we think are typically human are typically human at all. And the same is true for medicine. So for a long time, Western scientists thought, well, animals cannot use medicine. You need to be uniquely human, have this big brain, and be able to do this. And now we know that's just not the case. So when we think about the use of medicine by animals, we're really thinking about a different behavior. So when we see an animal that behaves in a certain way normally, when it becomes sick, it starts acting in a different way, and it starts using medicine. But it's really important to figure out if an animal is actually using medicine or whether something else is going on. And that's because in a lot of the cases, an infected animal may actually behave differently, not to help itself, but because the parasite is manipulating its behavior for its own benefit. And a great example is provided here with these flies. So we have two flies here. As you can imagine, the fly at the bottom is a female. The one at the top is a male that is mating with this female. But the catch here is that that female is dead. And that female is dead because she's infected with a fungus, and that fungus has killed her, but also changed her muscles, that she spreads out her wings in an inviting courtship behavior for the male. The fungus is also producing pheromones that attract the male to mate with her. So this male, instead of getting offspring, actually gets infected with the parasite. So this is a great example of how parasites can manipulate their hosts and their behaviors to improve their own success at the cost of those animals. The other thing we have to be careful with, and there's a lot of examples where we think animals may use medicine, but we just don't have the clearest evidence to prove this yet. And one really interesting example comes from lemurs and capuchin monkeys that often use millipedes. Now, these millipedes are great animals that actually make toxic substances, so they make liquids full of toxins, and they do this to protect themselves against predators. So when they get attacked, they ooze these liquids, and that deters a lot of their predators. But what these lemurs and capuchins have discovered is that when you harass these millipedes, you can pull them apart and bite them. They start rubbing them into their fur, and they start smearing all these toxins into their own fur. And what that does, it keeps away mosquitoes and botflies and other insects that transmit all sorts of terrible parasites. The problem is we don't know if that's the reason that these animals use these millipedes, because what they also do is they rub these millipedes into each other's fur, and it has this really social function. You know, you and I may go for a beer in a pub, and that is for social reasons. It's not to cure us of parasites. And it may be the same for these lemurs and the capuchins, that they do it for that reason. But as a nice side effect, it also keeps parasites away. So this is why we have to be really careful when we look at animals to really determine if they're using medicine. And the first studies to do that really came from chimpanzees in the 1980s. And the story here is a very intriguing and fun story. And I think it's also important to highlight who the people were that did the research, because that really shaped in how they were thinking and how they really discovered that animals can use medicine. So the story is of a primatologist called Mike Hoffman. And Mike Hoffman was in Japan. He came from the United States originally, but he does always primatology training in Japan. And that's important because in Japan, the culture and the religions are very, very different in the sense that they never viewed humans as very different from nature and other animals. And there's a photo here that I actually took in the Metropolitan Museum of Art several weeks ago in New York. And this is a modern impression of one of the messengers of the Shinto gods that was part of the Shintoism as a religion in Japan. And as part of that religion in Buddhism, people really viewed themselves as part of nature. And that also means that when they looked at animals, they didn't have the desire to be different from them and to ascribe different qualities to humans at all. And the other member of the team was Mohammadi, and Mohammadi was a traditional healer in Tanzania, where Hoffman did his fieldwork. And this is important because he was very well versed in the local traditions of using herbal medicine, traditional medicine. And so when he looked at animals, and he also knew that his grandfathers had looked at animals to learn about medicine. So he knew that animals can use medicine. So that team was really important. And they were looking at animals, they were tracking chimpanzees. They had given the chimpanzees names. There was another big difference with primatology in the United States or in Europe at the time. And they were following a chimpanzee called Chausiku. And the reason for their research was to figure out how older chimpanzees act in their societies. What is the role of elder individuals? And they kind of stumbled in this whole idea of medicine when they were following Chausiku. And she was really behaving off. One day, she was really lethargic. She had dark urine. She was lying on her side to defecate. She built a nest in the middle of the day to rest. These are all things that the chimpanzees normally don't do. And then what they saw, she went to a particular shrub, and she went there, she pulled off the branches and then stripped away the bark. And then she started sucking the inner pith that is filled with bitter fluids. And the plant is known as Majonso, and this is what Mohammadi told Mike Hoffman. And he said, this is Majonso, it translates to bitter leaf, and we use this as medicinal herb in our traditional medicine. And that was really the first time that Hoffman thought, well, maybe the chimpanzee is using this as medicine as well. So the next day they went back, they found Chausiku, and they found that she had recovered after about 24 hours. And this is exactly the same amount of time that the traditional healers in Tanzania use or find that when they use this as a treatment, that the relief of the symptoms occurs. So that wasn't enough, of course, to demonstrate much, but what the researchers did was a whole load of different studies to show that chimpanzees often become sick with intestinal parasites, worms that live in their guts, that the plants that they use have chemicals that kill those worms, that a lot of chimpanzees use these plants when they are sick, but they avoid it when they're not sick. And also during the rainy season, that when there are more parasites, they found that the chimpanzees use these plants more often. And together they put all those pieces of evidence together to show that this animal was indeed using medicine. And that was really the first scientific demonstration that animals can use medicine, other animals than humans. Now, at the same time, there were people studying birds, and a lot of birds, people had seen that when they built their nests, they put all sorts of plants and greenery in their nests, and they didn't really understand why that was. And one leading hypothesis in the 1980s, so at the same time that the chimpanzee studies were done, was that the birds did this to keep parasites away. And then we can think of parasites such as ticks and lice and mites, all things that suck the blood of the chicks in the nest. But they couldn't really prove that. Now, on the right here is a picture of a sidewalk in Mexico City. It's not a very pretty picture, but it is there to demonstrate that there are cigarette butts lining the sidewalk. So people smoke their cigarettes and then discard their cigarette butts with the filter attached. And it turns out that that habit gave us a really good evidence of why the birds are using things in their nests to keep parasites away. And this is the story of Montse Suarez Rodriguez, who was an undergraduate student at the time at UNAM in Mexico City. And she was really interested in understanding how urbanization and how humans leaving trash in the city, how that would affect the nest building and the survival of chicks for birds. And so she was studying the nests of house finches and house sparrows. And what she found is that a lot of the times in the nest, there was a lot of white, fluffy material. And she couldn't figure out what it was until one day it rained, and then she could smell smoke. And she realized that that white fluffy material was actually the little fibers from the filters of the discarded cigarette butts. And what she also found is that across many different nests, that if there were more cigarette butts in a nest, there were fewer blood-sucking parasites. Now that is still, correlational. It doesn't show us that the birds use it. So then she did a really ingenious experiment. Now, it took her 2 years, but what she did was really develop an artificial lining of the nest. So the nest has an outer part, and then inside there is a lining that the birds make. And she could figure out how to make that lining so that she could go to an existing nest, take out the lining the birds had made, put her own lining in there. And then what she did is she added ticks that were alive and ready to suck blood of the chicks in the nests, or she added ticks that were dead, or she added no ticks at all. And what she found then is that when there were live ticks, the birds started collecting more of the cigarette butts, and that helped their offspring. So the chicks survived better, they had fewer parasites, and they had higher fledgling success. Now, I'm looking very happy about a cigarette butt in this other picture here. And that's not because cigarettes are good for us, but because I find it such a fascinating story that these birds can use these cigarette butts as a form of medication. But what it also illustrates is that, as we know, cigarettes aren't good. They have a lot of bad things, bad chemicals in them that can be really bad for our health. And that is what the researchers found as well. So despite the positive effects against the parasites that help the chicks also had some abnormalities in their blood cells because of the chemicals in the cigarette butts. And that is something that is very similar to the medicine that humans use, right? When we use a medicine, there's often all sorts of side effects. And this is what really defines medicine in both humans and other animals, is that, medicines aren't free, so to speak. There's always side effects. And this is true for the cigarette butts. It's true for the plants that the chimpanzees use, because in a high enough dose, they can kill the chimpanzees. It's true also for the chemicals in the plants that monarch butterflies use, because in high doses, those can also be very dangerous. Now, all these findings have been very controversial. And for a long time, there have been a lot of people that said there's just no way that animals can do this. This was true for chimpanzees, it was true for birds. But that at the same time, chimpanzees were kind of okay for a lot of people, because chimpanzees have big brains like humans. We have a lot in common with them. They are our closest living relatives. And so people said, okay, well, maybe if animals can do it, chimpanzees can do it, but surely other animals cannot. But now we know that there are many different species of animals that can use medicine. And one other example is ants. And I love this picture. This is David Attenborough, who's one of my personal heroes. He has done so much for nature with his beautiful documentaries. Happy birthday to him a few weeks ago, turning 99, and still making amazing documentaries. But here he is in the Jura Mountains in Switzerland. And where he is at is a nest of wood ants. And these nests can be so big that it can be bigger than a person. And these ants often contain a lot of little white pieces that are actually pieces of resin. And resin is the sticky material that trees produce. And the trees produces as a protection against wounds or against infection or insects. But it turns out these ants collect all these pieces and they put it into their nest. And it turns out that it has a lot of antimicrobial properties. So it prevents infections with bacteria and viruses and fungi. And they do this especially when there is brood, so baby ants in the nest, and it really keeps them healthy and prevents all sorts of infections. Now we see a similar story in honeybees, and this is really intriguing as well, because sometimes the worker bees don't go out to collect pollen or nectar, but they go out to collect that same resin that the trees or other plants produce. And what they do then is they bring that back to the colony, and there's other workers that help them remove that really sticky stuff from their legs. They mix it with wax that they make themselves to make a substance called propolis. And propolis is the stuff that, when you look at wild bees that often live in hollow trees, as you can imagine inside a tree, that's a very rough surface with all sorts of gaps and grooves and everything. And what the bees do is they fill that completely with this propolis, make it really smooth, really beautiful. And for a long time, people thought this is just a kind of cement. But it turns out that this is really an important medicine for the bees. So just like those ants, what the bees do is they collect it, and it prevents all sorts of infections with microbes, but also with mites that are really detrimental to the honeybees. Now, honeybees are really important, but they're also in trouble. And so several years ago, Whole Foods, a supermarket chain in the United States, did this campaign where they removed all the produce in the produce section of a supermarket to see what we would lose if we were to lose honeybees. And that is based on all the crops that honeybees are needed for to pollinate. And so this is a real issue. And they did this campaign because honeybees are declining. And so in the United States and the United Kingdom and other places, there's a lot of mortality. Sometimes we call it colony collapse disorder because we don't really know what's going on. But what we do know is that a lot of the problems of honeybees are caused by parasites. In this picture, we have a parasite, a Varroa destructor mite, as the name suggests. That's not a very nice mite. And you can really think of this as maybe a tick the size of a donut that sits on your stomach and sucks out your liver, because that's what these mites do. And in addition to that, they transmit all sorts of viruses, including deformed wing virus that crumples up the wings of the bee so they can no longer fly. So they have all these threats of parasites at the moment. And probably a big reason for that is that the bees can no longer use their medication. They're not allowed to use their propolis anymore. And the reason for this is that the way we keep bees in industrial beekeeping is very different from the way that the wild bees live inside hollow trees. So now we have our bees in boxes that have 6 planks, 1 at the bottom, 1 at the top, 4 on the side. And there's nowhere for the bees to put their propolis. And what they do is they put it at the top where the lid meets the walls of the box. And the beekeepers don't like this for obvious reasons. Really hard to remove that lid, really hard to collect the honey and do the maintenance on the hives. And so they remove it all the time. And over time, they've selected against bees that use a lot of this propolis. And as such, the bees lose their medicine and they have a lot of diseases now that are causing a lot of problems. The nice thing about this story is that there's also a really simple way of bringing back this medicine to the honeybees. And the way that this can be done, you can just have your planks that you use to make a hive. And instead of keeping it smooth, you can make grooves in the sides of it. And the bees will fill that up with propolis. And as a result, they're healthier, they produce more babies, and they produce more honey as well. We have similar stories about livestock, because in the livestock industry, we have a similar idea of, removing the medicine, and not on purpose, but just because of the way that we keep our livestock. And so when we think about how we keep livestock, we give them this mixed rations food that we make that we think has all the nutrients in it that they need. But the problem is that it doesn't include a lot of the medicinal compounds that the animals would find in nature. Now, research at Utah State University of several decades now has shown that sheep and goats and cattle are actually really good at learning how to medicate themselves if they are given choices. So you can do experiments with goats, and when they have parasitic worms, you can give them different foods, and the food that relieves their symptoms, they will make that association. So the next time they are sick, they're going to go for that same food again. And what is interesting about it again is that in the livestock industry, we don't give them those choices. And instead, what we're doing is we're just throwing a lot of antimicrobials at them, a lot of anti-worm medicine, and that has resulted in a lot of evolution of resistance, so they're no longer useful. So what the researchers at Utah State really try to do is bring back the more natural ways that our animals can find the foods that they need. And ideally, they say we can put our animals in paddocks where we have a lot of different plants that they can choose from. But even in more industrial livestock industry, there are ways to introduce different sources of food to the animals so they can choose when they need to. And again, that is a way to bringing back the medicine to our animals that we have taken away from them. And we can make the animals healthier. And something that's really exciting to me is that when I was reading about this research, they did experiments where they had one experiment with cattle and they had 20 calves. Then one group, they gave just a mixed ration that they always get. For another, they gave the different components and let the cows choose. And they found that the animals, when they can choose themselves, they actually eat less because they only eat as much as they need, wherever it's a mixed ration, they overeat to just get what is limiting them most. And because they eat less, it actually costs less money to raise the animals to get the meat, but it also produced less greenhouse gases, which was super interesting. So letting animals have their choices, letting them choose their own food, make their own diet, and let them medicate has a lot of additional benefits beyond the health of the animal. Now, how do animals know how to use medicine? And this is a question I often get. And certainly when I started working on monarch butterflies and showing that, people say, yeah, but how do the butterflies know what to do? Because when we think about when we get sick, we go to a doctor. The doctor has been in medical school for a long time. Then you get pharmacist, a particular drug that was developed by pharmacists based on many years of research. And obviously animals cannot do that. So the funny answer to that question is how do they know? Is that oftentimes I don't think they do know. And to give a great example of that, we can look at woolly bear caterpillars. So these are the caterpillars that a lot of people would call fuzzy wuzzies. And these caterpillars are a little bit different from the caterpillars in monarch butterflies in that they can actually eat a lot of different foods. And it turns out that some of the foods has a lot of alkaloids in them. And those alkaloids can protect them against parasitoid flies. Now, parasitoid flies are really intriguing flies. Certainly, if you have an interest in parasites like I do, they're intriguing. If not, they're really just awfully gruesome. And here's an example of parasitoid flies in a monarch caterpillar. And what these flies do is they lay their eggs on the caterpillar, and then when the maggots come out, they eat their way to the insides of the caterpillar, start eating up the caterpillar from the inside out. And when they're ready to become adult flies and to pupate, they burst out of the caterpillar and thereby kill the caterpillar in its wake. But it turns out for those woolly bears is that when they eat a lot of the alkaloids, they can actually recover from these infections. And circled here is an egg of one of these flies. And so when they eat more alkaloids, they can recover, they can kill the flies. And researchers have done some really amazing experiments. But one cool thing is that these caterpillars have 4 different taste receptors, and one of them specifically tastes these alkaloids. And what the researchers did, they had tiny little electrodes, and they managed to put them into the taste buds of these caterpillars. They either had sick caterpillars or healthy caterpillars, and then they gave them these alkaloids, and they could measure how their nerve cells responded to these alkaloids. And they found when the caterpillars were infected, the nerve cells responded much more strongly, and that basically means that the alkaloids tasted better. And so when the caterpillars are sick, the alkaloids taste better, they eat more of it, and that cures them of these flies, right? And what that means is that the caterpillar doesn't have to know that it's sick, it doesn't have to know what alkaloids are, it doesn't have to know that it should change its diet. It's essentially its gut telling, its body telling it, these alkaloids taste good, eat more of them. So I think there's a lot of cases in the animal kingdom where this sort of thing happens. I think this is similar in the monarch butterflies that I study, but oftentimes I think it's the body's just simply telling the animal, this tastes good, eat more of it. And that is a way in which they can recover. Now, that doesn't mean that animals cannot learn. And I had just mentioned that sheep and goats are really good at learning through association. So when they recover from eating a particular plant when they are sick, they will learn, and the next time they are sick, they will be looking for that particular plant. So individual learning is important. Then there's also social learning, and this is really exciting too. I've mentioned the chimpanzees before that suck the bitter pith from this bitter leaf, but there is another way in which chimpanzees use medicine, and that is by swallowing leaves whole. So even in the 1960s, Jane Goodall had already observed, oftentimes when you look at the feces of the chimpanzees, there is leaves in there that haven't been digested, that haven't even been chewed. And it turns out that the chimpanzees oftentimes swallow leaves, and the leaves that are really, really hairy and really rough, and they swallow them. It goes through their gut and then basically pulls out parasitic worms in an action that's like Velcro. So the parasites get stuck to the leaves and they get pooped out. Now, as you can imagine, if you have to swallow a leaf that may be this size, that is really hairy, that's going to be really, really tough. So what the chimpanzees do is they fold the leaves and then swallow them. And there's many different ways to fold a leaf. And it turns out that different groups of chimpanzees use different folding methods. And what that means is that there is one chimpanzee that comes up with a method, and then the other chimpanzees in the group copy that behavior. So there's that social learning, copying behavior in addition to the individual learning that the animals can have. All right, so then we get to dogs. And I'm sure there is a lot of dog owners and dog lovers among the crowd tonight. I have my own dogs, and in fact, this is one of my dogs eating grass, and he keeps on doing this a lot, which is always very intriguing. I let him because I believe it's good for him, and cats do it too. Now, what is really interesting is that we don't really know why these domestic animals do it because there has been very little research. There's been very few studies that look at our domestic cats and dogs. Why are they eating the grass? But luckily, there have been a lot of observations in wild carnivores. So then we think about jaguars or coyotes or wolves or mountain lions. And people have found over many decades that they often eat grass. And then oftentimes you can find the grass in either their vomit or in their feces, and then there are parasites with it. And the example on this slide is very recent, a study on jaguars in South America, where the jaguar ate really, really rough grass, then threw up, and circled in red is a parasitic worm. And so what we think is the case is that our domestic animals still have this behavior from when their wild ancestors developed this behavior to get rid of parasites, but our animals now may do this because these wild animals probably don't also know that they have parasites. What they do know is they don't feel good. They may have stomach upset, so they eat grass and they start feeling better. And our dogs and cats still do that. That doesn't mean they have parasites, but sometimes they do it to get rid of other stuff. Some of you may have found little bits of Lego or Barbie heads in your vomit or feces of your dogs because they ate the grass. So it's something they don't feel good, they ate the grass, and they often start feeling better. Now, others in the room here, in the webinar here, may really be cat lovers, and cats love catnip. And this is when they get catnip, they start rolling around and they go in this kind of ecstasy and they look very, very happy. And they actually are very happy. So people have known about catnip for a very long time. We even have Neolithic evidence that thousands of years ago, people grew catnip, most likely for the cats that they had. And there's other plants. One plant is called silvervine that occurs in Asia. And I love this picture of a Japanese story, which is called The Battle Between the Cats and the Mice. And the mice in the story know how to intoxicate the cats with the silvervine. So they give this to the cats, and the cats go all crazy. And so the mice can win the battle. So we have known for a long time that cats love catnip and they love silvervine. But why is that? And this is so interesting because it's very recently, in the last 10 years or so, that Japanese researchers really started studying this. And this was a research team with cat behavior specialists as well as chemists that were really interested in the chemicals in the silvervine plant. And what they did, first of all, is extract all the chemicals from these plants and divide them in different fractions. And then they applied those chemicals to filter papers in little petri dishes in a cage with a cat to see what the cat responded to the most. And what we can see is that the cat really loved number 3. And so they discovered in this way there's one particular chemical in the silver vine that make the cats go crazy. Now, if you have seen this behavior, you know that cats love it. And that's exactly right. So they get a lot of pleasure out of this behavior and out of this chemical. And what the researchers also found is that these cats, like us, they make their own opioids that the body produces. We can think of endorphins that we produce in humans. And so we have this whole hormonal system where they produce these opioids that their own body makes, and it makes them happy. And it's these chemicals that really stimulate that. So to further investigate that, the researchers then blocked the receptors for these opioids. And so here's the same cat on day 1 and on day 2. On day 1, the receptors are not blocked, and that cat can still feel pleasure and is going wild over that little bit of chemical in that dish. The same cat on day 2 had its receptors blocked. It can no longer feel pleasure. Don't worry though, the next day it was fine again. But on that day, it doesn't feel that pleasure, so it doesn't go crazy over this chemical. It basically gets bored and it gives up and it's ready to leave the cage. So there's nothing here for me. So we know that it gives cats pleasure, but is there more to it? And when the researchers were at a conference in London, they ran into someone who was a real specialist in mosquitoes and parasites of mosquitoes. And what she suggested, she said, well, what's really intriguing to me is that when you look at these cats, is that they're really rolling around and making a lot of contact with the chemical. And it really suggests to me that these cats are coating themselves in the chemicals. And since she worked on mosquitoes, she wondered, maybe this is a defense against mosquitoes. So to test that, first of all, the researchers then put these petri dishes at the top of the cage with the idea that if the rolling around is really meant to get these chemicals impregnated in the coat of the cat, then they should no longer roll around on the floor here, but try to roll around at the top of the cage instead. And you can see exactly that. This cat is trying to roll around at the top of the cage. And of course, that doesn't work, so it falls to the bottom. But it's really keeping on trying. It's really making contact with those chemicals. And it really indeed comes to these mosquitoes, because what the researchers did then is they started putting these chemicals on cats or not, and then put cats in cages with mosquitoes. And they found that the cats that had the chemical didn't get as many mosquito bites. So these mosquitoes really don't like that chemical, and it works like a repellent. And that sounds sad. And that's what the researchers agreed with. They thought it was really sad to do these experiments with the cats. So then they smeared the chemicals on one arm of themselves. They didn't do it on the other arm, and then they put their arms in the same cage with mosquitoes. And they found that the arm with the chemicals just didn't get as many of these mosquitoes. And on the basis of that, they discovered that this chemical works for humans too. So they've patented this chemical. They're trying now to persuade a pharmaceutical company to really develop it into a mosquito repellent for the use by humans. Now, I love that, because what it is showing this is that animals can still teach us a lot of things that we didn't know. They can help us discover chemicals that we can use to protect ourselves against parasites. Now, one of the most surprising things for me when writing my book was that this is actually not new. A lot of people have known this for a long time. And so when we look at shamans and when we look at traditional healers, they have looked at animals for thousands of years to discover medicines. And so when we look at North America, for example, a lot of the Native Americans in their shamanic rituals become bears. And bears are really seen as the master of medicine. So by becoming a bear, you can learn the secrets of medicine from that bear. And this is very common practice. I was recently at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., where you can see all these masks and the claws that are used in these rituals. So the bear really has that medicinal power that we can learn from. And this is why when you look at Native American tribes, they all have at least one medicine that they have named after bears, whether that's bear root or bear herb or what have you. And a lot of us think, well, that's nice. That has very little to do with us. But think again. Because what is true as well is that aspirin, the chemical in aspirin, was first discovered by bears as well. So when bears come out of hibernation, they're really sore, they're really inflamed, they're really stiff. And the first thing they do is they go to the bark of a willow tree and they eat that. And that bark has a lot of salicylic acid. And so this behavior has been copied by humans. They have passed it on from one human to another until the pharmaceutical company used that same chemical, changed it a little bit, and turned it into aspirin. So even when we think about pharmaceutical drugs, oftentimes they have an origin in traditional practices, and a lot of times those have an origin in the use of medicine by animals. It's not just bears. There's great stories about elephants, both in Asia and Africa. I have mentioned Mohammedi, the traditional healer who worked with Mike Hoffman on the chimpanzees. And his grandfather actually developed a treatment for stomach upset by looking at an elephant. Because he noticed there was an elephant with stomach upset. That elephant went to a particular tree, took the leaves, put those leaves in his throat and mixed it with water. And then he spat out the leaves, but drank the water. So we're essentially talking about a kind of tea that this elephant made. And that was copied, and that is still used as a treatment for humans today when you go to Tanzania. Goats have taught us a lot of things too. And I think this is a really interesting story as well. So at my university campus, we have a Dancing Goats coffee bar. We also have a Kaldi coffee bar. And the story is that Kaldi was a goat herder who lived in what is now Ethiopia. And he saw that when his goats ate the berries of a coffee bush, that they would become very active, very alert, and start dancing and jumping around. And he told this story to a monk of a nearby monastery, who then brewed those berries into a drink that we now call coffee. And of course, when you think about coffee, it's like a drug, right? It's like a medicine. And so this was discovered by goats. And goats have discovered other things for us too. You may have heard of horny goat weed. You can imagine what the goats became when they ate this weed. This is actually weed that you can order on Amazon these days. It's not just used for impotence, but also for a lot of other things to increase blood flow and things like that. And again, it's something that goats discovered for us. So animals can teach us a lot, and nature is full of medicines still undiscovered. And sadly, of course, we're losing a lot of species at the moment. We're undergoing what we think is a sixth mass extinction. Of course, the last one wiped out most of the dinosaurs. This time we're losing a lot of different species as well. And I think what is really worrisome about that is there is a lot of reasons to be worried about it. But when we think about medicine, it means that we're losing a lot of sources of medicines that we could use. But also we're losing a lot of the animals that use those medicines and that can help us figure out what medicines we could still discover. And so to me, I'm a lover of nature and animals and plants. So for me, there's enough reasons to preserve nature already. But I think this gives us yet another reason to be careful and really try to maintain nature and also to recreate it. So back in Atlanta, I'm part of the Rosalind Carter Butterfly Trail, which is a nonprofit organization that really helps to recreate nature. And one of the things that I found also extremely interesting when doing the research for the book is that I learned that the biggest crop that is grown in the United States is not corn, it's not soybeans, but it's grass. And it's the grass that people have in their front lawns and that have in their parks and in the golf courses. And it's grass that usually doesn't belong where it lives. People use tons of pesticides and fertilizers, and they add tons of water to keep that grass green. Now it turns out that if you only replace about 10% of that lawn in your front yard with a native garden, you can really recreate a lot of nature. But you can also provide the medicines that our animals need, whether it's pollinators, whether it's other wild animals, or even our pets. So, and this is why as an organization, we're really recreating gardens. We have built 4,000 gardens over the last 10 years to really help people realize that recreating nature is useful and it preserves species, both plants, animals, but also medicines for our animals. And this is just one example of my own yard, my front yard of a house I moved to several years ago now. And I've really trying to replace that front lawn bit by bit. And it attracts beautiful insects, including bumblebees, and it includes monarch caterpillars. But it's great also for other animals, including the dogs and cats that may find all sorts of medicines in those gardens. So this is my call to all of you. If you have a chance to replace at least a little bit, if you have grass, replace it with some native habitat. It can actually go a really long way. Now, I like to end with this little movie here of my dogs. You have already seen one of them before. That's Tucky. The other one is called Cooper. And this is actually a funny story because we were doing a photo shoot for the university newspaper that wanted to write about my new book and about animals using medicine. And as we were setting up the lights by a little river on campus, the dogs just went for it, ate that grass. And it's often like they were saying to us, guys, we don't understand this big deal. What are you talking about? We have known about medicine used by animals for millions of years. With that, thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jaap, for an absolutely fascinating talk there. So I've got some really great questions from the audience. So if it's all right, I'll just crack on. So the first one is regarding the birds. So the question says, filter cigarettes have only been around for about 70 years.
Yeah.
So how did birds discover the use, and how widespread is it across the bird population?
Yeah, so I mean, birds are very inventive, and in this case, we're talking about sparrows and finches that are really good at living in cities, and they nest in buildings, so they're really used to city life. But wild birds often use other things. It really started with observations of all sorts of different plants. So they could actually use the tobacco plants from which we get the cigarettes in the first place. And so, for these birds that live on this campus, it's just maybe harder to find those plants. And birds are kind of lazy. So when they can find a cigarette butt near their nest, they'll take that instead of flying 500 meters to find a plant that can do the same job. But it's a great question. And I asked the researchers when I was visiting there, I said, are you worried about successful public health campaigns if everyone stops smoking? Is that bad for the birds? And they said, no, it's not bad at all, because they'll go straight back to the plants that they can use instead. And it will actually be healthier for everyone.
Yeah, that's great. And then we've got another question going back to the dogs, just to kind of go over that again. So the question said, I always believed that cats and dogs eat grass to induce vomiting or to settle a sick stomach, but a vet told me this is not true. So do you believe that they do this to help their stomachs to heal?
I definitely believe that. Yeah. And I know I agree with some vets, but I also know I agree with other vets who think that's exactly why they do it. I mean, there's different ideas out there, and some people say they do it for nutrition, but they don't digest the grass. So it seems really hard that, it doesn't seem like they do it for nutrition. They often vomit the grass out undigested, or they poop it out. And so, yeah, it really seems that, I even had an example with my own dog, the black and white one. Recently, he ate a rubber band that my son had left on his floor. It was of Pi Day, so the number 3.14 and a lot of digits. And I discovered that I pulled it out of his mouth, but half of it was missing, and I didn't know where it was. Then we went for a walk, and he ate grass, and 6 hours later, he threw up, and there came the other half of that rubber band. So it's clear to me that, yeah, they're responding to something doesn't sit right in their stomach. They don't feel good, and that's when they eat it. But beyond that, I think my dogs do it a lot, and sometimes I feel like it's become more of a habit as well. So they don't only do it when they're sick, but they certainly seem to like it when they have an upset stomach, and it seems to help them.
Yeah, fantastic. And then we've got another question thinking about the experiment with the cats and the kind of the love of the catnip. How dangerous is a mosquito bite for a cat?
Oh, yeah, no, that's a great question. I didn't mention that. But so, first of all, the mosquitoes suck blood. And, if there's enough of them, that can actually be really detrimental. So, you can actually lose a lot of your blood cells and get anemia from it. But a more important reason is that they transmit really terrible parasites. So, if you have a cat, you may be aware of heartworm and actually treat your cats for it. And they get transmitted by mosquitoes. So, heartworms and other parasites are really, really detrimental to the cats. And one thing that I didn't mention that's also really exciting is that the research also looked at zoo animals. So they actually looked at lynxes and a Amur leopard and found that those bigger cats have the same behavior. And that suggests to them, when you look at the common ancestor lived about 10 million years ago, that this behavior has been around for a very long time. So it's been a very strong behavior, very important for the cats. But yeah, it's probably because of the parasites that are transmitted by the mosquitoes.
Fantastic. And then this is a super interesting question for me as a psychologist. Are there any examples of animals using plants to help them with psychological states such as depression or grief?
Yeah.
And
Mm.
is it mainly behaviours such as being, physically sick,
Yeah.
and then maybe other members of the group provide psychological support?
Fantastic question. So I've really focused on infectious diseases, and the reason for that is where we have the strongest scientific evidence. So when I was really compiling the book, it was really, I wanted to make sure that everything was watertight, right? And that experiments have been done to really prove that these animals are doing what they're doing because of the use of medicine and getting better. But there are a lot of observations, and there are even practices now where some people use herbs for mental issues in cats and horses and dogs. And so there's definitely a lot of plants for which it's shown that they reduce anxiety and reduce depression. And yeah, there's even courses one can take to learn about how to do that with herbs and essential oils. So I think that's, we still need a lot of the scientific studies to really show and prove that. But it seems very true that a lot of animals use plants also to feel calmer and to reduce anxiety. So I think that is really going to be a lot of studies going into that to really show that.
Yeah, amazing, fantastic. And then I think we've got time just for one more, and that's going back to the butterflies. So
Mhm.
you said that kind of in terms of how do the animals know how to do it, you kind of covered that they can do it through individual learning. So like the
Yeah,
goats eat something, feel better, so then they eat that again when they're feeling like that in the future. And then you looked at social learning with the chimps with the way they
yeah,
fold the leaves.
yeah,
But butterflies themselves, are making a choice about where to lay
yeah,
their eggs, so they
yeah,
don't get any feedback from that.
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
how do you think the butterflies have evolved to have that preference for the toxic
Yeah. So
milkweed?
it's absolutely right. They cannot learn from their experience. So it must be an innate behavior, just like we saw with the woolly bear caterpillars that also cannot learn, right? They're infected. They go for the alkaloids because their stomach tells them this is good, keep on eating it. I think similar things happen in the monarch butterflies. We don't know this yet because we haven't figured it out yet. So we're really wanting to do this and doing experiments to show it. I think what is going on is that when these monarch butterflies, when they have these parasites, that their whole body is obviously disrupted. They probably don't feel good. And we know that the more medicinal milkweeds taste more bitter. And we also know that when the butterflies lay eggs, they never they never fly to a plant and lay an egg straight away. They go to a plant and they taste it. They actually taste it with their little feet, which is super cute.
Oh wow, that's
And
awesome.
so they
Tongues
can
in your
taste
feet.
if those plants are bitter. And it's true that a lot of plants that are medicinal are bitter. And so my hypothesis is that when they are infected, they have a stronger preference for that bitter
Better.
taste. So just like
Yeah,
the alkaloids in the woolly
yeah,
bears, when they're infected, they go to a plant, it tastes bitter, and they're more inclined then to lay that egg. And so then it
yeah,
really goes back to the genes. If they have the genes that allow them to do that, therefore they have more
yeah,
healthy offspring, they are passing on those genes to those
yeah.
offspring. So yeah.
Yeah. Amazing. Lovely. Well, with that, I'd like to thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. Yep. And again, thank you very much, audience members, for answering loads of fantastic questions as well.
Thank
So
you
to
so
the
much.
audience, thank you very much for attending today's event. Please be sure to check out what else is coming up in the festival. And just reminding that a recording of this event, if you thought it was brilliant and want other people to watch it, it's available on the Festival of York Ideas YouTube channel, which can be accessed from the Watch Again section of the festival. And you'll be contacted by email when the video is available to view. And finally, if you'd like to know more, dig in deeper, if you'd like to purchase a copy of Jaap's book, Doctors by Nature, How Ants, Apes and Other Animals Heal Themselves, then it's available from the partner bookseller Fox Lane Books. So please do check it out. And as I got a complimentary copy, which I was very excited about, and I can verify it was a fantastic read. So thank you very, very much, Jaap, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.